At first, nothing about Sakina Thompson seemed unusual to the people who followed her online. She was stylish, polished, and carefully put together. Her videos showed luxury, beauty, confidence, and a life that looked curated down to the smallest detail. She worked as a nail technician in New York and presented herself like someone in control of her image. To the outside world, she looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was. But that image hid something much darker. Because behind the fashion, the makeup, the social media presence, and the confident persona, Sakina was unraveling. And over time, that unraveling turned into obsession. Then jealousy. Then stalking. And eventually, it turned into one of the most personal and violent kinds of murder there is. The kind driven not by money, not by survival, not by self-defense, but by fixation. This is the story of how a woman flew more than 1,000 miles to hunt down her ex-boyfriend's new love interest and kill her inside her own home. And what makes this case even more chilling is that the warning signs had been there long before the murder happened. Sakina Thompson built a strong online persona. She had thousands of followers and posted the kind of content people associate with someone living well. She talked beauty, perfume, fashion, everyday glamour, and pieces of her personal life. Her page projected confidence and attitude, the kind that makes people believe they're watching someone who always lands on her feet. For a while, part of that image included a man named Terry Thermogen. To Sakina's audience, their relationship looked serious. It looked stable. It looked like one of those modern romances people show off online. Attractive couple, chemistry, matching energy, the kind of relationship that makes followers think they're watching something solid. But as often happens, what looked secure on the outside was much more unstable in reality. The relationship between Sakina and Terry was inconsistent. It moved in and out of breakups, reconciliations, distance, and uncertainty. It was the kind of connection where one person often appears more emotionally invested than the other. And according to the picture that later emerged, that person was Sakina. She appeared to be deeply attached to Terry, even as his attention shifted elsewhere. During one of their breaks, Terry began seeing another woman. Her name was Kayla Hodgson. Kayla was 23 years old, lived in Florida, and worked nights as a bottle girl. People who knew her described her as lively, beautiful, outgoing, and naturally magnetic. She was someone who attracted attention easily, not because she was forcing it, but because her personality and presence made her stand out. She was the kind of person who brought energy into a room. And once Terry became involved with Kayla, the dynamic changed completely. What may have once been a messy on and off relationship between Sakina and Terry now had a rival in the picture. But rather than fully directing her anger at Terry, Sakina's focus shifted more and more toward Kayla. That shift matters because it shows how the situation evolved. Instead of accepting that Terry's choices were the real issue, Sakina began treating Kayla as the obstacle, the threat, the target. That is often how obsession works. It doesn't always attack the source of the pain directly. Sometimes it locks onto the person seen as replacing you, the person seen as taking what you believe should still belong to you. And that is exactly what happened here. As time went on, Sakina's behavior toward Kayla became more aggressive and disturbing. According to people close to Kayla, the harassment started building in ways that felt both invasive and relentless. There were prank calls. There were threatening messages. There were hostile words delivered through silence, mockery, and intimidation. The calls weren't funny. They weren't random. They were part of a pattern meant to unsettle Kayla and let her know she was being watched. That pattern escalated further when it became clear Sakina seemed to know things she should not have known. At one point, people close to Kayla said Sakina appeared to know when Terry picked Kayla up, where they were going, and when they were spending time together. That suggested something more than ordinary jealousy. It suggested active monitoring, and later accounts indicated Sakina may have used a tracker in Terry's car to keep tabs on his movements. If true, that means this wasn't just emotional obsession. It had already crossed into surveillance. That is the point where a situation stops being merely dramatic and starts becoming dangerous. Because when someone is not only jealous, but actively tracking, watching, and inserting themselves into your movements, the risk changes. It becomes personal. It becomes physical. It becomes unpredictable. At the same time, Sakina's social media posts began taking on a darker tone. Some of what she posted appeared more hostile, more pointed, and more difficult to dismiss as just online attitude. Certain remarks and videos that might once have seemed performative or vague began to look different after the murder. In hindsight, they felt like glimpses of a growing rage that was no longer staying contained inside her. The anger was no longer abstract. It had a face, and that face was Kayla. According to later interviews, Sakina didn't stop at calling and messaging. Eventually, she tried to bring the conflict offline. At one point, she reportedly showed up at a place where Kayla was expected to be, seemingly waiting for a confrontation. She had not come dressed for a conversation or closure. She came looking ready to fight. That moment is important because it reveals the progression. This was no longer a woman venting online or making angry calls in private. She was now physically showing up in places connected to Kayla, inserting herself into her world, trying to force contact. Kayla, on the other hand, had already blocked Sakina on every platform. That was her attempt to cut off the harassment and remove herself from the drama. But blocking someone only works when they are willing to respect boundaries. Sakina clearly was not. Instead of backing off, she escalated again. In July of 2022, she boarded a plane from New York to Florida. That detail alone says everything about intent. This was not a spontaneous argument in the heat of the moment. This was a person making travel plans, crossing state lines, and going directly into the environment of the woman she had been fixated on. You do not fly over 1,000 miles by accident. You do not arrive in another state in disguise unless you already understand that what you are doing needs to be hidden. And that disguise would become one of the most chilling details in the case. When Sakina arrived at Kayla's apartment complex, security footage later captured her wearing clothes completely unlike her normal polished look. She had on a hat, a mask, and a coat. It was a look designed not for style, but for concealment. She did not want to be recognized. She did not want to be remembered easily. One of the neighbors in the building would later describe an unsettling encounter from that early morning. Around 2 or 2:30, there was a knock at the door. When the neighbor looked out, there was a woman there. The woman claimed someone had stolen her bag and said she was knocking on doors because she believed someone on that floor had taken it. But the story was strange. The woman seemed distracted, looking over her shoulder, not fully engaged in the conversation. Then she asked the neighbor's age. That question alone was bizarre enough to make the whole interaction feel wrong. The neighbor, a teenager, told her she did not know anything about the bag and closed the door. A short time later, there was aggressive banging elsewhere. The woman was still around, still searching, still moving through the area. That encounter now reads like something much more sinister than a stranger asking about lost property. It sounds like someone trying to locate the right apartment. And that is exactly what investigators came to believe. At around 5 in the morning, Sakina finally found Kayla's apartment. She went inside, and there, the harassment ended in horrifying violence. Kayla Hodgson was stabbed to death in her own home. The attack was brutal, not quick, not restrained, not ambiguous. She was stabbed 37 times. That number matters because it says something about the intensity of the assault. This was not a single impulsive strike followed by panic. It was sustained, furious, personal. It reflected not just violence but overkill, the kind of extreme force often seen when rage and obsession fully take over. Inside the apartment, Kayla's dog was there through the attack. That detail makes the scene even more haunting. This was her home, her private space, and someone had come all the way from another state to turn that home into a killing scene. After the murder, security cameras captured Sakina leaving, and investigators noticed something critical right away. She was no longer wearing the disguise she had arrived in. Instead, according to the evidence presented, she had changed into Kayla's clothes. That detail is disturbing on multiple levels. It suggested she had changed after the attack because there was blood everywhere. It also suggested a level of calm and deliberate behavior after the killing. She was not simply running blindly in shock. She was thinking about how she appeared as she left. Later that day, Kayla's body was discovered, and the case formally began. Police arrived to a scene that immediately told them this was no accident and no suicide. The violence was too severe. The wounds were too many. The circumstances were too obvious. Detectives started where they always do, with the people closest to the victim and the last known contacts around her. One of the first key people they encountered was the man who discovered her body. His name was Ralto Robinson. He was not Terry. He was another man Kayla had been seeing. That detail added early complexity to the case because investigators had to first determine whether the person finding the body might be connected to the murder. He told police he had been trying to reach Kayla, came by the apartment, saw her car, knocked, heard the dog, and eventually found the door unlocked. Inside, he found her on the floor. As with any homicide investigation, detectives had to scrutinize him closely. They asked about his movements, his relationship with Kayla when he last saw her, whether anything was wrong between them, and what he touched after finding her. He explained that he had tried CPR after being instructed by dispatchers. He answered questions, and investigators documented everything. At this early stage, the job was to eliminate possibilities and build a timeline. While that was happening, word spread quickly through Kayla's circle. Friends arrived, family arrived, and the emotional devastation at the scene was immediate. Kayla's loved ones were desperate for answers. Her mother was away working and had to be notified. Her cousin arrived in shock, struggling to process whether this was real. Later, as more family members gathered, they made one heartbreaking request. They wanted to pray over Kayla before her body was removed. That entire part of the aftermath speaks to the human side of this case. Long before the courtroom, long before the sentencing, this was a family being forced to confront sudden, unimaginable violence. The loss wasn't abstract. It was immediate, intimate, and unbearable. As detectives continued their early interviews, one thing kept coming up. Kayla was well liked. She didn't have known enemies. No one could point to an obvious local threat. And that meant investigators needed to look beyond her immediate circle in Florida. That is when one name came up and changed the entire direction of the case: Sakina Thompson. Once that name surfaced, things started moving fast. People close to Kayla began describing the history of harassment. They told investigators about the prank calls, the threats, the online fixation, the stalking behavior, and the way Sakina had become consumed by Kayla's existence. They described her as relentless, unstable, and unable to let the situation go. Investigators then began verifying that information through hard evidence. Flight records confirmed Sakina had traveled from New York to South Florida shortly before the murder. Rideshare data showed that she used a fraudulent Uber account to get to Kayla's apartment complex near the time of the killing. Security footage showed a woman matching Sakina's build and appearance entering and leaving within the relevant window. Taken together, that was powerful evidence. This wasn't rumor anymore. It was movement. It was travel. It was presence at the scene. It was behavior that lined up with the murder. Less than a month after Kayla's death, Sakina Thompson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But the case did not end there. Because once she was in court, Sakina offered an entirely different version of events. According to her, the killing was not a planned murder. She claimed it was self-defense. She said that Kayla attacked her first, that a fight broke out, and that she blacked out in the middle of it. She told the court she was pregnant and believed Kayla was trying to hurt her and her unborn child. She claimed that after the confrontation, she changed clothes because there was blood everywhere, and she was scared. That defense tried to reframe the entire case. Instead of a woman stalking and hunting down another woman, it presented Sakina as someone who had gone there, been attacked, and reacted in fear. But prosecutors argued that the evidence simply did not support that story. And when you look at the sequence of events, their argument is hard to ignore. She flew to Florida. She wore a disguise. She wandered the complex in the early morning trying to locate the right apartment. She entered Kayla's home. Kayla was stabbed 37 times. She changed clothes afterward. She left the scene. Those are not the natural footprints of self-defense. Those are the footprints of pursuit. The prosecution pointed to the planning and the behavior after the killing as evidence that this was not panic, but intention. They argued that her actions before and after the murder showed a clear mind moving toward a goal, not someone suddenly forced into a desperate fight. One especially important piece of evidence came from DNA. The judge later noted that Sakina's background in the beauty business ended up connecting directly to the evidence that helped convict her. DNA found underneath Kayla's fingernails became a major part of the case. That physical evidence placed Sakina directly in the violent struggle, and it worked against the defense attempt to blur what happened. There were also other uncomfortable facts around the case. Sakina was pregnant with Terry's child at the time, and Terry appeared, at least in some ways, to support her version of events. There was even discussion around whether he had knowledge of what happened or was somehow connected to the confrontation, though the key facts verified in court centered on Sakina's actions. He reportedly submitted a letter asking for her release so she could help raise their child. Sakina also sought to avoid giving birth while incarcerated. Those requests were denied. And eventually, the case came down to what the court believed the evidence clearly showed, that this was a deliberate killing. At sentencing, the judge's language made the court's view unmistakable. This was described as a heinous crime. A woman had tracked down another woman, located her home, showed up there, and killed her. The court sentenced Sakina Thompson to life in prison without parole. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars. And in one sense, that closed the legal part of the case. But for Kayla's family, no sentence could undo what had been taken. One of the most painful parts of this story comes from the victim impact statements. Kayla's family did not speak about her like a headline. They spoke about her like what she actually was. A daughter, a sister, a bright presence, someone deeply loved, someone whose energy made people feel seen. They described her as the kind of person you do not meet twice in life. Someone whose spirit lit up every room she entered. Someone who was family-oriented, caring, generous, and easy to love. And those details matter, because cases like this can easily become consumed by the spectacle of obsession, the brutality of the murder, and the psychology of the killer. But the most important thing is who Kayla was before she became a victim. She was a real person with a life that was entirely her own, and that life was destroyed because another woman could not accept rejection. That is the center of this story. Not romance, not heartbreak, not betrayal in the usual sense. This was obsession weaponized. Sakina did not merely struggle emotionally after losing Terry. She chose to redirect that pain into hatred for Kayla. She stalked her online. She harassed her directly. She monitored the relationship. She physically showed up where Kayla might be. And finally, she boarded a plane, found her apartment, and killed her. All over a man who, by the end of it all, had moved on again anyway. That truth makes the entire case even more tragic and senseless. Because the one constant at the center of Sakina's obsession was not love. It was entitlement. The belief that if she was hurting, someone else had to pay for it. And that belief cost Kayla Hodgson her life. By the end of the case, justice had caught up to Sakina. She lost her freedom forever. She destroyed her own future. She gave birth in custody, and she will live out the rest of her life inside prison walls. But even that outcome is not the real ending. The real ending is a family that still has to wake up without Kayla. A mother who still has to live with the knowledge of what happened to her daughter. Loved ones who will forever carry the image of a young woman taken in an act of jealousy and cruelty so extreme it is hard to fully process. That is what remains after the verdict. Not closure, not peace, just justice, imperfect and late, arriving after irreversible loss. And maybe that is what makes this story so haunting. Because on the surface, it starts like so many others do now. Social media, public image, relationship drama, jealousy, cryptic posts, online harassment. Things people often dismiss as messy, embarrassing, or immature. But underneath all of that was something much more dangerous growing in plain sight. A fixation, a plan, a willingness to travel, disguise, hunt, and kill. For Whispers of Crime, this case is a reminder that obsession rarely appears all at once in its final form. It builds. It tests boundaries. It escalates. It starts with watching, then contacting, then controlling, then showing up. And when nobody fully understands how dangerous the pattern has become, it can end in unimaginable violence. Kayla Hodgson should have been safe in her own home. She should have been allowed to live her life without becoming the target of someone else's insecurity and rage. Instead, she became the victim of a woman who could not let go. And that is what makes this not just a murder case, but a story of obsession crossing every line until there was nothing left to stop it.